In the orderly proceedings of Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio has established routines and expectations that create a sense of predictability in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Cases are called in sequence, defendants approach the bench with varying degrees of nervousness or defiance, and the machinery of justice moves forward with practiced efficiency. But on this warm spring morning in May, something completely unexpected was about to disrupt the normal flow of court business in a way that would challenge Judge Caprio's understanding of justice, responsibility, and the innocent mistakes that children make when trying to do the right thing. The case that was called to the bench was that of Mr. James Patterson, a 42-year-old construction worker who had received multiple parking citations over the past few months. It was a routine matter that Judge Caprio had handled countless times before, a working-class man struggling to juggle job responsibilities with parking regulations, facing fines that would strain an already tight budget. Mr. Patterson approached the defendant's stand with the resigned expression of someone who knew he had violated parking rules but hoped the judge might show understanding for his circumstances. But what made this case extraordinary wasn't Mr. Patterson himself, it was the small figure that followed closely behind him as he approached the bench. Walking just a step behind his father was a young boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, whose serious expression and careful movements suggested someone who understood they were in an important and formal setting. The boy was small for his age, with dark curly hair, intelligent brown eyes that darted nervously around the courtroom, and clothes that had clearly been chosen with care for this court appearance. The boy's name was Tyler Patterson, and as Judge Caprio would soon discover, he had insisted on accompanying his father to court for reasons that would soon become heartbreakingly clear. Tyler stood quietly beside his father as the clerk read the charges. 3 parking violations accumulated over the past 4 months, totaling $425 in fines. Each citation represented a moment when Mr. Patterson had parked illegally while rushing between construction sites, trying to meet deadlines and maintain employment in a competitive industry where being late could mean losing work. "Good morning, Mr. Patterson," Judge Caprio said with his characteristic warmth, immediately noticing the young boy standing beside the defendant but choosing to address the legal matter at hand before inquiring about the child's presence. "I see you're here regarding several parking citations. Before we discuss the specifics, can you tell me a bit about your circumstances and what led to these violations?" Mr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with having to explain his financial struggles in a public setting, especially with his son present. "Your Honor, I work in construction, and the nature of my job requires me to travel between multiple job sites throughout the day," he began, his voice carrying the tired resignation of someone who had been struggling to make ends meet. "The parking violations happened because I was rushing between jobs and made poor decisions about where to park, trying to save time when I was running late." Judge Caprio nodded with understanding, recognizing the familiar pattern of working-class people facing fines for violations that stemmed from the pressures of employment rather than disrespect for the law. But before he could respond to Mr. Patterson's explanation, something unexpected happened that would transform this routine case into something far more significant. Tyler, who had been standing quietly beside his father, suddenly took a small step forward, his hand reaching up tentatively as if he were in a classroom trying to get the teacher's attention. The movement was so innocent and so completely out of place in the formal setting of municipal court that it immediately caught Judge Caprio's attention and caused a ripple of surprise throughout the courtroom. "Young man," Judge Caprio said gently, momentarily setting aside the legal proceedings to address the boy who was clearly trying to say something, "do you have something you'd like to tell the court?" The judge's tone was kind but curious, unsure of what this child might want to contribute to his father's parking violation case. Tyler looked at his father for permission, and when Mr. Patterson nodded with obvious confusion and concern, the boy took a deep breath and spoke in a clear voice that was remarkable for its courage given the intimidating setting. "Your Honor, I need to tell you something important about my dad's parking tickets," Tyler said, his words immediately creating a sense of anticipation in the courtroom about what revelation this young boy was about to make. Judge Caprio leaned forward in his chair, his experienced instincts telling him that whatever Tyler was about to say would be significant, possibly even changing the entire context of the case before him. "I'm listening, Tyler," the judge said, using the boy's name to establish a personal connection and encourage him to continue. "Please tell me what you think I should know." What happened next would become one of the most touching and unexpected moments in Judge Caprio's long career. Tyler reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the kind that elementary school children use for homework assignments. His hands were trembling slightly as he held it, but his voice remained steady as he prepared to make a confession that would leave everyone in the courtroom stunned by its innocence and unexpected honesty. "Your Honor, my dad got these parking tickets because of me," Tyler said, his words immediately shifting the entire dynamic of the case from a straightforward traffic violation to something far more complex and emotionally charged. "I did something that I thought would help my dad, but I made a mistake, and now he's in trouble because of what I did." Judge Caprio felt his throat tighten as he heard the guilt and remorse in Tyler's young voice. Whatever this boy had done, it was clear that he had been carrying the weight of responsibility for his father's legal troubles and had come to court specifically to set the record straight. The judge gestured for Tyler to continue, understanding that the full story needed to emerge before he could make any decisions about the case. "I need to explain something about my family so you'll understand why I did what I did," Tyler continued, his words revealing a level of thoughtfulness and context awareness that was impressive for someone his age. "My mom died 2 years ago from cancer, and since then it's been just me and my dad. He works really hard to take care of me, but I know that things have been difficult for us, and I've been trying to find ways to help him." The revelation about Tyler's mother's death immediately provided crucial context for understanding both the family's circumstances and Tyler's motivation for whatever action he had taken. Judge Caprio could see the pain flash across Mr. Patterson's face as his son mentioned his deceased wife, suggesting that the loss was still raw and recent enough to affect every aspect of their daily lives. "I'm very sorry about your mother, Tyler," Judge Caprio said with genuine compassion, understanding that the boy's actions, whatever they were, had likely been motivated by a desire to help his grieving, struggling father. "Can you tell me what you did that you think led to your father's parking tickets?" Tyler took another deep breath, steeling himself for the confession he had come to court to make, a confession that would reveal both his innocent good intentions and the unfortunate consequences that had resulted from a child's misunderstanding of how the adult world works. As Tyler prepared to reveal his confession, Judge Caprio could see the internal struggle playing out on the young boy's face, the desire to be honest warring with the fear of disappointing his father and potentially making the situation worse. The courtroom had fallen into complete silence, everyone present sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary and deeply human. "Your Honor, I need to show you something," Tyler said, opening the small notebook he had been clutching. "This is where I wrote down all the parking meter information that I thought would help my dad save money." The statement was puzzling to Judge Caprio, who couldn't immediately understand how a child's notebook about parking meters could have led to multiple parking citations. Tyler turned the notebook toward Judge Caprio, revealing pages filled with careful, childish handwriting, lists of street names, times, and notes that had clearly been compiled with serious effort and attention to detail. "I started keeping track of all the parking meters near my dad's construction sites about 6 months ago," Tyler explained, his voice taking on the earnest tone of someone describing what they had believed was a helpful project. "I noticed that my dad was always stressed about finding parking and feeding the meters, and he kept saying that parking costs were making it hard to afford things we needed," Tyler continued, providing the context that had motivated his actions. "So I decided to do research to help him figure out the best places to park and when the meters weren't being checked by parking enforcement officers." Judge Caprio was beginning to understand the outline of Tyler's plan, and he could already see how a child's well-intentioned but flawed logic might have led to serious problems. The judge remained silent, allowing Tyler to continue his explanation at his own pace. "I would go with my dad to his construction sites on Saturdays when I didn't have school, and while he was working, I would walk around the neighborhood and write down information about all the parking meters," Tyler said, his words revealing the dedication and thoroughness with which he had approached his self-assigned mission. "I wrote down which streets had meters, how much they cost, and what the time limits were." The image of a 10-year-old boy carefully surveying parking meters while his father worked was both touching and heartbreaking to Judge Caprio. Tyler had clearly been trying to contribute to his family's well-being in the only way he could imagine, using the observational skills and note-taking abilities he had learned in school to tackle what he saw as a practical problem affecting his father's livelihood. "But then I started noticing patterns," Tyler continued, his narrative revealing where his innocent research had led him astray. "I noticed that on some streets, the parking enforcement officers only came by at certain times of day. I thought that if I could figure out when they weren't checking meters, I could help my dad save money by parking during those times without paying the meter. Judge Caprio felt a wave of understanding wash over him as Tyler's mistake became clear. This intelligent, well-meaning child had essentially been conducting surveillance on parking enforcement patterns, believing that he was helping his father by identifying opportunities to avoid parking fees. The boy had no understanding of the legal and ethical problems with such a strategy. He had simply seen it as a way to save his struggling family money. I made charts in my notebook showing which streets were safe to park on during different times of day, Tyler explained, showing Judge Caprio pages filled with color-coded schedules that represented hours of careful observation and analysis. I used green for times when I never saw parking enforcement, yellow for times when they sometimes came by, and red for times when they always checked the meters. The sophistication of Tyler's system was remarkable, demonstrating analytical and organizational skills that would have impressed any teacher. But it also showed how a child's understanding of rules and consequences could lead them to believe that avoiding enforcement was the same as finding a legitimate solution to a problem. I was so proud of my research, Tyler said, his voice cracking with emotion as he began to understand how his efforts had backfired. I thought I was being helpful and responsible, like a good son should be. I gave my dad the notebook and told him he could use it to figure out where to park so he wouldn't have to spend so much money on meters. Mr. Patterson, who had been standing silently beside his son with an expression of growing shock and dismay, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, I need to explain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I had no idea Tyler had been doing this research or what his charts represented. When he gave me the notebook, I thought he was just showing me a school project or something he was working on. I glanced at it briefly, told him it was very thorough, and then put it aside because I was busy with work. Judge Caprio could see the guilt and regret on Mr. Patterson's face as the father realized he had inadvertently encouraged his son's misguided efforts by not paying closer attention to what Tyler had been doing. The judge understood that this wasn't a case of parental negligence but rather the common challenge of single parents juggling too many responsibilities and sometimes missing important signals from their children. But Tyler didn't give up, Mr. Patterson continued, his words revealing how his son's well-intentioned interference had escalated. He kept updating his notebook and leaving it on the front seat of my truck with notes about good places to park. I still didn't really pay attention to what he was doing. I just thought it was sweet that he was trying to help in his own way. Tyler's eyes filled with tears as his father described how his efforts had gone unnoticed and unappreciated, not because his father didn't care but because the communication between them had been indirect and unclear. Judge Caprio could see that this lack of direct communication about the family's financial struggles had led Tyler to take action based on his own assumptions and limited understanding. Then one day, about 4 months ago, I was running really late between job sites, Mr. Patterson explained, bringing his narrative to the point where Tyler's research had directly influenced his father's actions. I was parked illegally on a street where there were no available legal spots, trying to decide whether to move my truck or risk being late to my next site. Tyler called me on my cell phone. I had gotten him a phone so he could reach me in emergencies, and he told me to check his notebook. Judge Caprio was beginning to see how Tyler's system had finally been implemented, with consequences that the child had never anticipated or intended. The judge could imagine the scene, a stressed father receiving a call from his eager son, who thought he was providing valuable information that would solve his father's dilemma. Tyler told me that according to his charts, parking enforcement never came down that street during the time I needed to be there, Mr. Patterson continued, his voice carrying the regret of someone who had made a decision he deeply wished he could take back. He was so excited and proud of his research that I didn't have the heart to tell him I couldn't use it. And honestly, I was desperate enough that I convinced myself it might be okay to trust his observations just this once. The decision that Mr. Patterson described, to follow his son's advice despite his own better judgment, represented exactly the kind of moment when love, desperation, and poor decision-making could intersect to create problems that neither person intended. Judge Caprio understood that the father's mistake hadn't been malicious but rather born from a combination of time pressure, financial stress, and the desire to validate his son's efforts. "I got a parking ticket that day," Mr. Patterson admitted, his words confirming that Tyler's observation system had been flawed or that enforcement patterns had changed. But instead of recognizing it as a sign that Tyler's system didn't work, I made an even bigger mistake. I started looking at his notebook more carefully and trying to use his information to find safe parking spots during times when I was running behind schedule. Judge Caprio could see where this pattern had led. Mr. Patterson had received 2 more parking citations over the following months, each time believing that Tyler's research would protect him from enforcement, each time discovering too late that a child's observations couldn't account for the unpredictable nature of parking enforcement or the changes in patrol patterns that occurred regularly. As Mr. Patterson described how he had come to rely on Tyler's flawed parking system, Judge Caprio could see the boy's small frame beginning to shake with silent sobs. Tyler had come to court prepared to confess his role in his father's troubles, but hearing his father describe actually using the notebook and receiving citations as a result was clearly more than the child could bear. The weight of responsibility that this 10-year-old had been carrying suddenly became visible to everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I need you to understand something important," Tyler said through his tears, his voice breaking but determined to complete his confession. "My dad didn't want to use my notebook. Every time he got a ticket, he told me that my research was interesting but that he couldn't rely on it. But I kept pushing him to use it because I was so sure I was right, and I made him feel bad for not trusting my work." The additional layer of guilt that Tyler was revealing, not just that he had created a flawed system, but that he had actively pressured his father to use it, added profound complexity to the situation. Judge Caprio could see that Tyler's persistence had come from a place of wanting to prove his worth and contribute to the family, but it had ultimately created exactly the kind of problems he had been trying to prevent. "I would get upset when Dad got parking tickets, and I would say things like, 'But that's not on my list as a dangerous time,' or, 'You must have parked on the wrong block,'" Tyler continued, his words revealing how he had deflected blame rather than accepting that his system might be fundamentally flawed. "I made Dad feel like it was his fault for not following my instructions carefully enough, when really it was my fault for giving him bad information." Judge Caprio was struck by the sophisticated level of self-awareness that Tyler was demonstrating, recognizing not just his initial mistake but the ways he had compounded it through defensiveness and blame-shifting. For a 10-year-old to understand and articulate such complex dynamics of responsibility and accountability was remarkable. "The worst part," Tyler said, his small body now trembling visibly as he approached the emotional heart of his confession, "is that I found out 2 weeks ago that my whole system was wrong from the beginning, and that all of this is really, completely my fault." Judge Caprio leaned forward, sensing that Tyler was about to reveal something crucial about how he had discovered the flaws in his parking enforcement tracking system. The judge could see that whatever Tyler had learned had devastated the boy and led directly to his decision to come to court today to confess his role in his father's legal troubles. "I was at the library doing homework, and I was talking to Mrs. Chen, the librarian who helps me with my research projects," Tyler explained, his words revealing the moment when his illusion of helpfulness had been shattered. "I was telling her about my parking meter system because I was proud of it, and I thought maybe she could help me make it even better. But when I explained what I had been doing, Mrs. Chen got very serious and told me something I didn't know." Judge Caprio could imagine the scene, an enthusiastic child sharing what he thought was an impressive analytical project with a trusted adult, only to have that adult recognize the problematic nature of what the child had created. The librarian had clearly played a crucial role in helping Tyler understand the ethical and legal issues with his system. "Mrs. Chen explained to me that trying to help someone avoid parking enforcement isn't the same as helping them find legitimate ways to save money," Tyler said, his voice revealing the painful lesson he had learned about the difference between cleverness and wisdom. "She told me that even though I didn't mean to do anything wrong, I had basically been helping my dad break the law, and that my research was actually teaching me to look for ways around rules instead of teaching me to follow rules responsibly." The moral education that Tyler had received from the librarian had clearly been delivered with care and concern rather than harsh judgment, but it had nonetheless been devastating for a child who had believed he was being helpful and responsible. Judge Caprio could see that Tyler's world had been turned upside down by the realization that his best efforts to help his father had actually been harmful. "Mrs. Chen also told me something else that made me feel even worse," Tyler continued, his tears flowing more freely now. "She explained that parking enforcement officers have unpredictable schedules specifically so that people can't avoid them, and that my observations were probably just random coincidences that didn't mean anything. She said I had been giving my dad false confidence that led him to make risky decisions. The deflation of Tyler's system, the revelation that his careful research had been based on meaningless patterns rather than genuine insights, represented not just the failure of his parking project but a more fundamental challenge to his sense of competence and ability to help his family. Judge Caprio understood that Tyler was grappling with the painful lesson that good intentions and hard work don't always lead to positive outcomes. When I realized what I had done, I felt like the worst son in the world, Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying tremendous emotional weight. My dad has been working so hard to take care of me since Mom died, and instead of helping him like I thought I was doing, I made things worse. Because of me, he now owes $425 that we don't have, and it's all my fault. The absolute self-blame that Tyler was expressing revealed how the boy had internalized complete responsibility for his father's financial and legal troubles. Judge Caprio could see that Tyler had been carrying crushing guilt for the past 2 weeks, likely unable to sleep or focus on anything other than the damage he believed he had caused. I begged my dad to let me come to court today so I could tell you the truth, Tyler explained, revealing why father and son had appeared together before the bench. Dad said it wouldn't make any difference and that I shouldn't blame myself, but I told him that if he had to face consequences for breaking parking rules, then I should have to face consequences for giving him bad advice that led to the rule breaking. The logic that Tyler was applying, that he deserved to share in the consequences of his father's violations because he had contributed to the decisions that led to them, demonstrated both the boy's sense of fairness and his incomplete understanding of how legal responsibility works. Judge Caprio could see that Tyler believed that confessing in court would somehow transfer part of the punishment from his father to himself. Mr. Patterson finally placed his hand on his son's shoulder, no longer able to remain silent as Tyler took on more blame than any child should carry. "Your Honor, I need to make something absolutely clear," he said, his voice firm despite the emotion it carried. "Tyler is taking on way too much responsibility for decisions that were ultimately mine to make. He's a 10-year-old child who was trying to help his struggling family in the only way he could think of. I'm the adult who should have paid closer attention to what he was doing and should have explained more clearly why his system wouldn't work." Judge Caprio could see the love and protectiveness in Mr. Patterson's response to his son's confession, but he could also see the pain of a father who had been so consumed by survival and grief that he had failed to recognize his child's misguided attempts to shoulder adult responsibilities. The dynamic between father and son revealed a family that loved each other deeply but that had struggled to communicate effectively about their needs and limitations since the mother's death. "But I also need to say," Mr. Patterson continued, his voice taking on a tone of pride mixed with regret, "that Tyler's intentions were pure, and his efforts showed a level of dedication and analytical thinking that any parent would be proud of. He just applied those abilities to the wrong problem in the wrong way, and I failed to provide the guidance that would have redirected his efforts toward something more appropriate and constructive." Judge Caprio sat quietly for several moments after both Tyler and Mr. Patterson finished speaking, allowing the full weight of their testimony to settle over the courtroom. In his 3 decades as a judge, he had witnessed countless examples of human error, misguided intentions, and the complex interplay between love and poor decision-making. But never had he seen such a pure example of a child's innocent attempt to help his family leading to consequences that the child couldn't have anticipated or understood. "Tyler," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the warmth and compassion that had made him beloved by people who appeared in his courtroom, "I want you to look at me for a moment, please." The boy raised his tear-stained face to meet the judge's eyes, clearly frightened about what judgment might be coming but determined to face whatever consequences his confession might bring. "I need you to understand something very important," Judge Caprio continued, his words carefully chosen to address both the legal situation and the emotional burden that Tyler was carrying. "What you did, creating a system to track parking enforcement patterns, shows incredible intelligence, dedication, and analytical thinking. Those are wonderful qualities that will serve you well throughout your life." Tyler looked surprised by Judge Caprio's words, clearly expecting condemnation rather than acknowledgement of his abilities. The boy's expression suggested that he couldn't reconcile the praise for his skills with the problematic outcome of his project. "However," Judge Caprio continued, his tone remaining gentle but becoming more serious, "you learned an important lesson about the difference between cleverness and wisdom. Cleverness is about finding creative solutions to problems. Wisdom is about understanding which problems should be solved in which ways, and recognizing when a solution might create bigger problems than it solves. The distinction that Judge Caprio was making resonated throughout the courtroom as people recognized the universal truth in his words. Tyler was nodding slowly, showing that he understood the judge was teaching him something important rather than simply criticizing his actions. "You thought you were helping your father by finding ways to avoid parking costs," Judge Caprio explained, his words helping Tyler understand where his thinking had gone astray. "But what you were actually doing was encouraging rule-breaking as a solution to financial challenges. That's not help, that's leading someone you love toward more problems, even though that was never your intention." Tyler's fresh tears suggested that Judge Caprio's explanation was hitting home, helping the boy understand not just that he had made a mistake, but why his approach had been fundamentally flawed. The judge could see that Tyler was the kind of child who needed to understand the reasoning behind judgments rather than simply being told he was wrong. "Mrs. Chen, your librarian, was absolutely right to explain these things to you," Judge Caprio continued, validating the adult who had helped Tyler recognize his mistake. "And you showed tremendous character by listening to her, recognizing your error, and having the courage to come to court today to take responsibility for your part in what happened. That takes a level of maturity that many adults never develop." The acknowledgement of Tyler's courage in confessing seemed to ease some of the boy's distress, though he was clearly still struggling with guilt about his father's situation. Judge Caprio understood that Tyler needed to hear both that he had made a mistake and that making mistakes didn't make him a bad person or a bad son. "Now I want to talk to your father for a moment," Judge Caprio said, shifting his attention to Mr. Patterson while keeping Tyler included in the conversation. "Mr. Patterson, I understand that you're facing significant financial pressure as a single parent working in construction. I also understand that Tyler's system seemed like it might offer some relief from parking costs that were straining your budget." Mr. Patterson nodded, his expression showing both gratitude for the judge's understanding and continued concern about the fines he was facing. Judge Caprio could see that this father was far more worried about disappointing his son than about his own legal consequences. "However, you made a decision as an adult to use information from a 10-year-old child to guide your parking choices," Judge Caprio continued, his tone remaining compassionate but firm. "That decision, while understandable given your circumstances, represented a failure of adult judgment. You allowed your son to take on responsibility for solving adult problems, and you didn't provide the guidance he needed to understand why his approach was problematic." The accountability that Judge Caprio was assigning to Mr. Patterson was balanced with recognition of the difficult circumstances that had led to his poor judgment. The judge was neither excusing the violations nor ignoring the context that had made them more likely to occur. "But I also want to acknowledge something important about what I've witnessed here today," Judge Caprio said, his voice taking on a tone of deep respect. "I've seen a young boy who loves his father so much that he spent months trying to find ways to help ease his financial burdens. I've seen a child who took responsibility for his mistakes even when it would have been easier to stay silent. And I've seen a father who clearly loves his son deeply and who has been doing his best to provide for him during what must be an incredibly difficult time for both of you." The validation that Judge Caprio was offering to both Tyler and Mr. Patterson helped shift the atmosphere in the courtroom from one of judgment and guilt to one of recognition and understanding. The judge could see both father and son beginning to relax slightly, sensing that they were being seen as whole people rather than simply as violators of municipal codes. "Tyler, I want to tell you something that I hope will help you understand the situation differently," Judge Caprio said, returning his focus to the boy who was clearly still struggling with guilt. "Your father's parking tickets are not your fault. Your father made decisions as an adult to park illegally, and adults are responsible for their own choices, even when those choices are influenced by information or pressure from others." The relief that washed over Tyler's face as he heard Judge Caprio explicitly state that he wasn't responsible for his father's tickets was profound and immediate. The boy had been carrying the weight of adult-level responsibility for weeks, and hearing a judge, the ultimate authority figure in this situation, release him from that burden was clearly transformative. "But," Judge Caprio continued, not wanting Tyler to miss the important lessons embedded in this experience, "you are responsible for learning from this mistake and for thinking more carefully in the future about whether your attempts to help are actually helpful or whether they might be leading you or the people you love toward more problems." The nuanced assignment of responsibility that Judge Caprio was offering, absolving Tyler of legal or moral fault for his father's tickets while still holding him accountable for learning from his error, demonstrated the judge's sophisticated understanding of child development and moral education. Tyler needed to understand that mistakes were learning opportunities rather than evidence of his inadequacy or bad character. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Tyler asked, his voice still shaky but stronger than before. "I've been thinking a lot about this since I talked to Mrs. Chen, and I realize now that I was trying to fix the wrong problem. Instead of helping my dad find ways around parking rules, I should have been thinking about what I could do that would actually help our family in legal, positive ways." Judge Caprio felt his heart warm at Tyler's words, recognizing that the boy had internalized the crucial lesson about redirecting his energy and intelligence toward constructive rather than problematic solutions. "That's exactly right, Tyler," the judge said with genuine enthusiasm. "And that kind of insight is what will help you become not just a smart person, but a wise person." Judge Caprio looked at both Tyler and Mr. Patterson with an expression that combined judicial authority with genuine human warmth, and the courtroom fell into expectant silence as everyone waited to hear what decision this compassionate judge would make about a case that had become so much more than a simple parking violation matter. "Tyler, Mr. Patterson, I want to share something with you about why I became a judge 30 years ago," Judge Caprio began, his words suggesting that he was about to make this case into a teaching moment that would have significance far beyond the immediate legal resolution. "I became a judge because I believe that justice isn't just about punishing mistakes. It's about understanding why people make the choices they make, recognizing good intentions even when they lead to poor outcomes, and helping people find better paths forward." Both Tyler and his father were listening intently, clearly moved by Judge Caprio's willingness to share his personal philosophy and to treat their case as an opportunity for growth rather than simply an occasion for punishment. The judge could see that his words were already beginning to transform how they understood their situation and themselves. "Mr. Patterson, these parking citations are hereby reduced from $425 to $50, and I'm giving you 6 months to pay that amount," Judge Caprio announced, his decision immediately bringing visible relief to the struggling father. "I'm reducing the fines not because the violations didn't occur, but because I understand the financial pressure you've been under and the circumstances that contributed to your poor decision-making." Mr. Patterson's eyes filled with tears as he heard the dramatic reduction in his fines, understanding that Judge Caprio was offering him mercy that would prevent the financial catastrophe that the full penalties would have created. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you so much. I promise I'll never make this kind of mistake again." But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Turning his attention to Tyler, whose face showed a mixture of relief and lingering guilt, the judge prepared to deliver words that would change the young boy's understanding of himself and his potential. "Tyler, I want to give you something," Judge Caprio said, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a blank notebook, significantly larger and nicer than the worn one that Tyler had been using for his parking research. "This notebook represents a challenge and an opportunity," Judge Caprio explained, holding the notebook up so Tyler could see it clearly. "I want you to use this notebook to document a new project, a project about finding positive, legal, constructive ways that you can help your family and contribute to your community." Tyler's eyes widened with surprise and interest as he understood that Judge Caprio wasn't just dismissing his desire to help his father, but rather redirecting it toward more appropriate channels. The judge walked around his desk and handed the notebook directly to Tyler, creating a moment of personal connection that transcended the formal boundaries of the courtroom. "You have remarkable analytical skills, Tyler," Judge Caprio continued, his words validating the boy's abilities while channeling them toward better purposes. "You're observant, you're dedicated, you're willing to work hard to help the people you love. Those are wonderful qualities. But now I want to challenge you to use those qualities in ways that build up rather than trying to work around systems." Tyler clutched the new notebook to his chest, clearly moved by Judge Caprio's recognition of his abilities and grateful for the challenge to use them more wisely. "What kind of project should I do?" he asked, his voice revealing both eagerness and uncertainty about how to redirect his energy. "That's for you to figure out," Judge Caprio said with a warm smile. "But I'll give you some ideas to start with. Maybe you could research community organizations that help families like yours and create a guide about resources that are available. Maybe you could start a project at your school about financial literacy for kids. Maybe you could volunteer somewhere and document what you learn about helping others. The suggestions that Judge Caprio offered were perfectly calibrated to Tyler's demonstrated skills and interests while steering him toward activities that would be genuinely helpful and legally sound. Tyler was nodding enthusiastically as he listened, clearly excited about the possibility of finding constructive outlets for his desire to contribute. And here's the most important part, Judge Caprio added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I want you to come back to this courtroom in 6 months and show me what you've done with this notebook. I want to see evidence that you've learned from your mistake and that you've found better ways to use your intelligence and dedication. The accountability that Judge Caprio was building into his challenge, requiring Tyler to return and demonstrate his growth, would ensure that this experience became genuinely transformative rather than simply a moment of relief from consequences. Tyler would have a specific goal to work toward, and the knowledge that someone in authority believed in his potential enough to invest time in following up on his progress. Your Honor, I promise I'll make you proud, Tyler said, his voice filled with determination and renewed sense of purpose. I promise I'll use this notebook to do things that actually help people instead of just trying to be clever about avoiding rules. Judge Caprio smiled warmly at Tyler's promise, understanding that the boy had internalized the crucial lesson about wisdom versus cleverness that had been at the heart of their conversation. I already am proud of you, Tyler, the judge said, his words visibly affecting the boy who had come to court carrying crushing guilt. You had the courage to admit your mistake, the humility to learn from it, and the character to take responsibility even when it was difficult. Those qualities will take you far in life. But Judge Caprio had one more surprise for the Patterson family. Reaching into his own wallet, he pulled out $60 and handed it to Mr. Patterson. This is to help with the reduced fine, he explained, despite Mr. Patterson's immediate protests. Consider it an investment in a family that clearly loves each other and that deserves a chance to move forward from a difficult period without being crushed by financial penalties. The generosity was so unexpected and so personal that both Tyler and his father were momentarily speechless, struggling to process the fact that this judge had not only shown them mercy within the legal system but had also offered them financial help from his own pocket. It was the kind of compassion that would be remembered and cherished for a lifetime. Your Honor, we can't accept your personal money, Mr. Patterson finally managed to say, though his voice betrayed how desperately he needed the help being offered. You've already been more than generous with reducing the fines. You can and you will accept it, Judge Caprio said with gentle firmness. And when your circumstances improve, which they will, because I can see that you're a hard worker and a good father, you'll pay this kindness forward by helping someone else who needs it. That's how we build stronger communities. The concept of paying forward kindness rather than paying back a debt reframed the transaction from charity to an investment in community well-being. Mr. Patterson nodded his acceptance, understanding that Judge Caprio had given him a way to receive help while maintaining his dignity and sense of responsibility to others. Tyler, Judge Caprio said, returning his attention to the boy one final time, I want you to remember something important. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The measure of a person is what they do after they make mistakes. Do they hide from responsibility? Do they blame others? Or do they learn, grow, and find better ways forward? The life lesson that Judge Caprio was imparting would stay with Tyler far beyond this court appearance, shaping how he understood personal growth, accountability, and resilience. The boy was nodding seriously, clearly committing the judge's words to memory. You've already shown me today that you're the kind of person who learns and grows from mistakes, Judge Caprio continued. Now I want you to show yourself and your father that you're the kind of person who can transform a negative experience into positive action that helps others. As Tyler and Mr. Patterson prepared to leave the courtroom that day, the boy clutching his new notebook and his father holding the reduced fine paperwork and Judge Caprio's generous contribution, they turned back one final time to express their gratitude. Your Honor, Tyler said, his voice clear and strong, I promise that when I come back in 6 months, I'll show you that your faith in me wasn't misplaced. I'll show you that I learned the difference between being clever and being wise. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause as Tyler and his father walked toward the exit, everyone present understanding they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a legal proceeding, but a masterclass in compassionate justice that had transformed a child's mistake into an opportunity for growth and a father's legal troubles into a moment of redemption and hope. Judge Caprio would indeed see Tyler again 6 months later, and the young boy would return with a notebook filled with documentation of volunteer work at a food bank, research about community resources for single-parent families, and a proposal for a financial literacy program for elementary school students. Tyler's project would be so impressive that Judge Caprio would connect him with local educators and community organizers who could help expand his ideas into programs that would benefit countless other families. But perhaps the most important outcome of that day in court wasn't measured in projects completed or fines reduced. It was measured in a young boy's restored sense of self-worth, a father's renewed faith in the possibility of compassion from authority figures, and a community's reminder that justice at its best is about transformation rather than punishment, about recognizing potential rather than simply cataloging failures, and about showing mercy in ways that inspire people to become better versions of themselves. Tyler's innocent mistake had brought him to court expecting punishment, but Judge Caprio's unexpected compassion had given him something far more valuable: a vision of who he could become, the tools to get there, and the knowledge that even when we make mistakes, there are people who will see past our errors to the potential that lies within us, waiting to be nurtured and directed toward purposes that truly matter.